What's going on, everybody? My name is Jordan. I'm the head coach here at SaberSim, joined today by a very special guest, Dr. 2-Inch on DraftKings, who is fresh off of a $250,000 win at the DraftKings MMA Live Final. So wanted to bring him on today, talk a little bit about the Live Final experience, MMA DFS strategy, how he's using SaberSim to build these lineups here. Dr. 2-Inch, how you doing?
I'm doing great. I feel incredibly blessed right now, for sure.
Awesome. Yeah. So tell me, what does it feel like to win $250,000? What was that experience like?
It was incredible. I I wasn't even sure if I was going to win it, even down to the last moments. The last fight had ended with Islam Makhachev, and I needed a score of 118. That's quite the high hurdle, right? And I had no idea if I was going to get there in the moment. I was refreshing the app as fast as I possibly could, and it was a sweat. It was a hell of a sweat for sure.
So it went down to the very last fight for you.
Yeah,
Like it took to the
yeah,
bell ringing on the last one for everything to come
yeah,
together.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, like I said, I needed that score of 118 out of Islam. So even in a main event, right, with a grappling heavy favorite, that's still a bit of a high hurdle. And
Hmm.
Islam actually in that contest, he was probably one of the higher owned fighters in general on the slate, but he was only 40% or so. So that was a big differentiating piece within that lineup, that won the 250K.
Was there a moment throughout the slate as it was playing out where you realized you were probably kind of live?
Yeah, for sure. About two or three fights left. My wife was with me at the main event. I got to bring her with me.
Yeah.
So I had to turn and tell her that there's a significant chance that I have to place down a pretty massive hedge
Yeah.
on this fight in order to lock in a massive profit. And she doesn't, sports bet or anything. So
Hmm.
I just had to tell her, you have to trust me, right?
Yeah.
You've got to trust me. I know what I'm doing. I might have to deposit a ton of money into DraftKings because we were in New York. I don't usually have the access to that, to the ability with sports betting and all in Alabama. But because of our location, I was able to get that through. It was a $6,600 bet on Dustin Poirier to win, to hedge and win. I think it was somewhere around 30 or 40,000.
Yeah.
On top, I could have dropped as low as fifth place, which would have been a payout of 30,000, with a Dustin Poirier win. So that was the hedge there. And obviously, if Islam won, it would have been a payout of 100,000. If he scored over 118, the 250. So in between
Yeah.
the co-main event and the main event, I was spamming DraftKings trying to get that deposit down and get the
Man.
6,006, and that's a bet large enough to pop out up on the bottom of the ticker, during the broadcast of the fights oftentimes.
Yeah. Did it?
Um, I
Did
don't
they
know.
pull it up?
I haven't went back and watched the fight,
Yeah.
but it may have. I mean, they like to use that as promotion to encourage more betting action, right? So
Hmm.
they may have.
Yeah. I
That's
see
probably the
those.
biggest bet I'll ever have in my life, honestly.
I bet. I see those tweets pop up sometimes where it's like large bet
Yeah.
alert and like, yeah. So that's awesome. What was the celebration like immediately after the win?
So, the DraftKings guys, they came up to us. They had the Rainmakers Championship, the live final, and
Hmm.
the DFS one. So they took first and second place of the DFS and first place of the Rainmakers down to the octagon. So we got to take some pictures and everything
Awesome. That's so cool.
with our plus ones, and so that was a lot of fun. So that was more or less the celebration. They were rushing us around the stadium that we saw. There was a crowd fight that, like, people stopped right in front of us. So it
Yeah,
was sheer chaos afterwards for at least 30 or 45 minutes trying to get down to the bottom
I
of the
bet.
arena and everything against the
Yeah.
crowd.
And your head's
Oh,
probably spinning the whole time thinking
oh,
about
for sure, for
$250,000.
sure.
So yeah. So what was the kind of process leading up to that like? Like you're qualifying to get into this final round. Like any sweats leading up to that point? Like how were the finishes and the kind of pre-contests heading up leading up to it?
Yeah, so honestly, the cut downs went a little bit smooth. I felt
Yeah, that's good.
like Um, there was never really a crazy sweat. I was in good position throughout the nights. Um, and the satellite ticket that I got, I would never encourage directly chasing these big dollar, high dollar qualifier tournaments. You know,
Hmm.
as cool as the experience was, you can really lose a lot of money really quickly chasing these tickets. But there's overlay
Hmm.
often in these satellites, and there's satellites um, to these qualifier tickets that you can win.
Hmm.
So that's ultimately how I got my qualifying ticket. I won a $5 ticket that I parlayed up into a $475 qualifier ticket that I was able to use to get the not live final seat, but the world championship seat.
That's
So
amazing. So really quite a run. Not only the qualifying rounds to get to the final round,
yeah.
but two sets of
I
satellites
mean,
on the way
I don't
there.
wanna
That's
make it
amazing.
sound like I only put in $5 and parlayed it all the way up.
Yeah,
That's not what
yeah,
happened. I was playing a lot of these throughout the year, you know,
yeah.
but that just happened to be the path that got me to the 1 seat. And I had a seat back in 2021,
Hmm.
that I wasn't able to get past the first round with, so
So
it was
I am curious because I've done the overlay thing on
mhm,
satellites before. So how does that process actually look for you when you're identifying contests to play? Like, where is the line? One of the things I noticed is you kind of have to make a judgment call maybe a half hour before lock of like, yeah, I think this overlay is going to stick because at some point
mm,
you got to shift to start building your lineups. I mean, if you're
mm,
watching for something, uh, you know, to the last second, you don't have any time to build. Like, how do you kind of determine like, I think this is going to overlay.
yeah,
I'm gonna enter these contests.
yeah, so without I guess I'll reveal my strategy there.
Okay.
So they have these free head-to-heads, right? So you can use that as a place to store lineups temporarily.
Gotcha.
So what I do is I build out for a 100-man contest or whatever and store them in the free head-to-heads until I see the overlay pop up 3, 4, 2 minutes, 1
So
minute,
you're
whatever it
ready
may
with
be.
lineups ahead of time.
Yeah.
Gotcha,
And
gotcha.
you can
Cool.
use those as much or as little as you want. So if I want to force those particular lineups to the top of my queue, I just enter the same lineup 10 times and 10 free head-to-heads
Mhm.
and use it that way. And who is it? The DFS pro? God, I can't believe I'm forgetting his name. That he does the same thing, but it's with paid head-to-heads. It's like a quarter 10-cent lineups. He uses the 10-cent lineups in order to
Got
do
it.
that. So it's a similar method that I'm pulling from him.
Cool. Well, let's
Yeah.
hear a little bit more about the live finals event. What was that like? I know I've been to a couple, not MMA. I've done
Hmm.
basketball and I've done baseball. I haven't been lucky enough to go as an actual player yet. I've been taken as a guest a few times, so I haven't had that experience. But what was the live finals event like?
I mean, those are much bigger. The the football, baseball, or sorry, basketball and baseball ones are huge.
Yeah,
So that it was really cool. They paid for the hotel, you know.
yeah,
It was a beautiful hotel overlooking Manhattan, so we could see the One World Trade Center, the Empire State Building, all
super
the
cool. Yeah,
super cool landmarks from the hotel. We had dinner, and they rented out a box for us to sit in. Uh, DraftKings did with unlimited food, drinks, alcohol, the
yeah,
whole
yeah.
yards throughout the whole fights. And that MMA, you know, it's not like baseball or football where I mean, this is 5, 6 hours, you know, that
Yeah.
you're sitting in the crowd. So, you know, you
It's a
can get
long
it
open
on.
bar.
Yeah, yeah, it's like a wedding open bar almost.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Did they take you anywhere else while you were out there? Anything else like besides the fights?
So we had a dinner, like a meet and greet on, Friday night before the fights, but we not really.
Mhm.
I overheard a couple of the old heads that have been to like Fantasy Alarm I spoke to, and he mentioned that he'd been to basically every live final. He was rubbing it in my face and and mentioned that they oftentimes they do a lot more of the activities for the bigger live finals like football, like baseball.
Gotcha.
But no, not really for this one.
What was your favorite overall moment apart from winning the 250K?
Yeah, so they brought. up to the box. They brought Arman Sarukian up
Okay.
to the box, and
Awesome.
I've been blessed enough to win two Rainmakers trips to UFC events.
Hmm.
Um, and the last one that I to was the main event with Arman Sarukian in UFC Austin. So
It's
that
super
was
cool.
really cool to meet him in person after I just watched him in person at a main
Yeah,
event. Yeah,
that is
so
awesome.
I think that was probably my favorite experience short of the massive win.
Awesome. Cool. Well, let's talk a little bit about MMA DFS in general. How long have you been playing MMA? What got you into it originally?
Um, yeah, so for DFS in general, I started around 2020, so I'm still relatively young compared to a
Yeah.
lot of a lot of the guys that are at especially at the top. Um, I actually, you may not believe me when I say this, but I won a $20 bet with a friend of mine, North Carolina versus Kentucky.
Hmm.
We're both from those areas roughly, right? And we're big fans. Just a friendly wager. Deposited that into DraftKings to see what I could do. And I've slowly, very, very slowly built that up to the point where I'm at now. I never deposited a dime other than that $20 into
That is
my draft.
amazing. Wow. That is awesome.
I'm pretty proud of that.
Yeah, that is awesome. I wish I could say the same. That is not the case for me. I had some
So
bumps getting started, but
that was in 2020. I was grinding free rolls. They had what was it? They had the free Madden Sims contest. Like there was four or
yeah,
five of them every single day with like 250 up to first place. So I
yeah,
played every single one of those to build my
that is
bankroll up.
amazing. That's awesome.
Um, I got it to the point where it was somewhere around $500 to $1,000 before I started playing like 20 max, $1,
Hmm.
10-cent quarter jukebox type contest, and yeah, I that's still, and I think this is still going to be my mo. That's still where I sit for the most part. Is 20 max contest is almost
Hmm.
exclusively all I play. But anyway, I digressed from the question a little bit.
No, that's great.
Um, MMA DFS, I probably started picking that up around January 2022 or so. Um, I was never. I, I mean, I watched UFC with my dad whenever I was really young, but I
Hmm.
wasn't too big of a fan. But actually, Blender on his podcast, The
Hmm.
Theory of DFS, I remember he used to talk about it um, a lot about how great of a sweat MMA DFS is, and how you can avoid dupes, and it just sounded like free money whenever he was describing it.
Yeah.
So I started taking a shot around then, and I had a lot of fun with it.
Yeah, it's a similar boat for me. I was never like a huge fan of the sport, but I got
Hmm.
into the DFS side of it kind of first, just because it seemed like a fun game type, and then became a little bit of a bigger fan after that.
Yeah.
After playing a few slates, I mean, it is a extremely fun sweat. I think it's got
Oh,
a
for
good
sure.
case to be like one of the most fun live sweats to actually sit down, watch the event, watch your lineups as they're playing out.
I think it's my favorite for sure. I think golf could be if I was better at it,
Yeah.
but
Golf's
but
tough, man. I love the golf sweat too. The cut sweats on Fridays, obviously super fun. The Sunday sweats.
yeah.
But yeah, it is a tough sport, for sure. But the majors in particular, I think are like peak DFS sweats as well for golf. But
Yeah.
now I'm digressing here. So what are some of the other sports that are in your regular rotation? What were you kind of playing as you were building up that bankroll?
Yeah, so I the Madden Sims is where it started,
That's
right? But
amazing. Starting on a $20 bet into the Madden Sim free rolls,
yeah.
building up a bankroll. That is an amazing story. I don't
I
think I've
mean,
ever heard anybody say that their like origin story in DFS was the Madden Sims
ah,
contest. I love that.
it's been a long road. It has been a long road.
Real quick on
Um,
that. And I don't want to take too much time, but what was your kind of general strategy on those? Like, what was your approach to winning those contests?
um, so let's see. There's a guy right now, PhD DFS. He does a lot of talking about the satellites, especially in these Madden Sims.
Yeah.
But in general, you can use the average projections because just the average outcomes because those are pretty reliable for the big name players because they run so many sims so often, right?
Yeah,
But
interesting.
so you don't need to do much more than just pull the DK CSV, and then you can tweak it a little bit because you scrub out the terrible players that have an average score of 6, but that's because they came in for one play, 1 out of every 8 games and scored a touchdown, like,
Mhm.
there's outliers that are in there where their averages aren't reflective of their true projections, but other than that, you just scrape those out
Gotcha.
and go from there. You like to target secondary wide receivers more often than not because people gravitate towards wide receiver ones, quarterbacks almost exclusively.
Mhm.
So that was a little bit of my strategy, but some differentiation there. Um, and you only have to hit so often because they're free. Like it doesn't matter
Right.
how long it takes to get good at it if they're
That's right.
free. I don't know if they're still doing that. Honestly, I don't think they are.
Yeah.
But during COVID and even for about a year or so afterwards, they were really trying to promote that, I
Mhm.
suppose, to keep people active in the app and keep people engaged. So I definitely took advantage.
Yeah, yeah, that's awesome. Cool. So yeah, I cut you off anyway. So what are some of the other sports that you were
Oh
kind of
yeah,
playing alongside that and that are in your rotation now?
yeah. So I play a bit of everything. I would say aside from MMA, NBA and NFL are
Mhm.
definitely right at the top, which is probably the root for probably the same answer for most higher volume DFS players. If you're not playing the NFL, then
Oh yeah, that's you got to be playing NFL.
yeah, yeah. So I love those two sports especially, but MMA is always going to have a special place in my heart at
For
this
sure,
point.
forever now. Yeah. What's your is MMA DFS your favorite
I
DFS
mean, it
sport
is
now?
right now. It
Yeah,
is
yeah, I
right
bet
now.
riding
But
that high. Yeah.
uh, I think my favorite sport to watch is probably still the NFL,
Mhm.
maybe. But I'm at school at the University of Alabama right now, and I think uh, the UFC has even surpassed college football for me
Yeah,
from a viewership perspective because you have to make a choice
right.
often on Saturdays, and more often than not, I find myself making the choice of the UFC. So
That's awesome. Yeah, they are
there's
really
something
fun
to
to
be
watch.
said for that,
It
especially
is.
in Tuscaloosa.
I bet. I bet. Yeah, you probably can't tell anybody that around there.
Yeah, that might
You'll
be a
get in
cardinal
trouble.
sin.
Yeah, yeah. Cool. So we'll come back to some MMA DFS strategy stuff in here in a second. I want to talk a little bit about your experience with SaberSim. What kind of initially brought you into using SaberSim? What attracted you to the software?
Yeah, so turn of the new year this year, I previously worked a lot. I've always gotten my projections from Stochastic,
Hmm.
um, and so whenever they started making the transition to simulation tools, I really had to reevaluate and make a choice between. It was a natural transition, right? So I decided to reevaluate and make a logical choice between the programs. Um, and I felt like SaberSim really handled a few things especially well. Um, and the biggest thing of those would be the range of outcomes, right?
Hmm.
So I built my own simulation tools in the past and wrote some different programs to help me work through DFS as a free to play player,
Yeah.
in these Madden sims and everything. I was always trying to minimize my cost of my process, right? So
Hmm.
um, whenever whenever Stochastic started making that transition and started the kind of sim war, I was looking for different options. And that range of outcomes was, I felt like a game changer. And I didn't see many other places in the industry trying to push that agenda.
Yeah.
Um, so, especially with MMA, MMA is the perfect example where every single distribution should be a bimodal distribution, where
Hmm.
if a player or a fighter has a 30% implied odds of a win, you should have a roughly 30% on one side of the plot and 70% on the other side of the plot.
Right.
And their distributions of outcomes should be clearly separated peaks based on that implied win percentage. But more often than not, what simulation tools or other projection sites tend to do
Mhm.
is a median outcome and a Gaussian distribution from there. So I think that was one of the biggest things that pushed me in the direction of choosing SaberSim within the sim war.
Yeah. Gotcha. Why is that range of outcomes so important to you when you're building your lineups?
Yeah, so obviously, right, being able to capture, um, the ultimate goal is to capture upside, right? So
Mhm.
if, yeah,
Well, and
sorry,
no, you're good, and I mean, I just like to hear it from somebody else's
yeah,
perspective sometimes too, because I talk about this stuff all the time where, you know, for me, a lot of it is that average projection alone doesn't communicate that upside. You can't necessarily just
mm.
use that summary of a full range of outcomes and say, well, now we have this upside, especially in MMA, because that average is so heavily dependent on the win odds. Like
Mhm,
you're
mhm,
never going to get an underdog that actually shows up with high upside just looking at the average projection alone, because that 10%
mhm,
upside outcome for
mhm,
10%
mhm.
implied win favorite is so low. That's kind of the way that I like to think about it. But
Yeah, so I think I may have a perfect example for this. Tell me the question one more time.
I was just curious, like why the ranges of outcomes to you is such an important part, was such a big factor for you. Why does that matter so much?
Yeah, yeah. Actually, I do have a perfect answer for this. Um, I might transition it into a story um about Perez versus Almeida, but I need to make sure, if you'll give me just a second, I want to make sure that I'm right on something. That I think Almeida was projected higher than
Hmm.
Perez last week, but I chose her because of her range of outcomes. I just want to confirm that before I start spewing, if that's okay.
Yeah, no, of course.
That would be June 1st.
I was going to pull it up as well.
No, she was slightly higher. I mean, where I'm going with this, you can obviously see their distributions are nowhere near equal. Like Jailton Almeida's obviously was a much sharper peak, meaning that he hits these outlier outcomes of above 110, 120 much more infrequently. And you're just never going to see that data at any other site.
Yeah.
See where I'm coming from?
Yeah,
So that's
absolutely.
ultimately why I made that choice um, for her instead of Almeida, but on the lineup um, that won it for me.
This was from the June 1st slate. Maybe I'll just pull this up on the screen.
Okay, sure.
And then if you want to kind of just talk through and I can kind of follow along here.
Sure. Yeah,
Okay.
because then you can show the visual of those two distributions. I mean, that was key to my process. I can't reiterate this enough. I was even talking to the guy who won the Rainmakers World Championship about this exact issue. Yeah, so I felt like this slate came down to a key point for me where I
Hmm.
had to choose between Jailton Almeida and Aline Perez. Now, their projections, right, were fairly similar
Hmm.
with SaberSim and most of the projection sites, but I felt like there were key differences within their range of outcomes, especially that you aren't going to see with most projection sites.
Yeah.
So what I'm referring to in particular is with the ceiling outcomes when we're talking top 20% or so um, range of outcomes. Aline Perez significantly outperforms Jailton Almeida.
Hmm.
Um, and that's for a very logical reason. Why, right? That Jailton Almeida, whenever he gets the fight to the ground, it tends to stay there. He tends to lay on his opponent and grind out control time. Whereas Aline Perez, more often than not, if she's able to control the grappling game, she's going to be constantly chaining takedowns and continuing to grind up that score.
Hmm.
So that we see clearly in the distribution of outcomes, and that forces Aline Perez to be a bit of a stronger play. Jailton Almeida came in significantly higher owned in that contest, and I credit this play to be one of the things that differentiated me from my opponents and um, forced me near the top.
That's awesome. Yeah. Do you tend to look at like the percentiles here as a part of your process, like
For
95th,
sure.
85th?
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
So with with the live final competition and the two cut down contest,
Hmm.
I was looking at a lot of film. I'm not a no ball type of player. I'm
Yeah.
not a no
I'm
ball
not
player
either.
by any means, but I do think in MMA more than any other sport, there is an edge to watching fighters say last previous 3 fights or so,
Hmm.
and being able to pick up on key aspects that um, may swing fights, right? How quick is this guy striking versus this guy, or
Yeah.
this grappling edge? How is Jocelyn Edwards going to hold up to Aline Perez's grappling? And they had an opponent, right, that was able to handle Jocelyn Edwards on the ground. She was able to control Jocelyn Edwards on the ground consistently. Um, but Aline Perez took her down with ease, right? So that's a big tell, um, or at least I thought it was a big tell that Aline Perez may have a significant edge and be able to chain these takedowns against um, Jocelyn Edwards.
Do you
Um,
do anything in like UFC stats? I know Will on our
yeah.
team is pretty big on that and recommends in general if people want
Oh
to go
yeah.
a little bit deeper digging in there.
Yeah. So that's the first step for me, especially these 3 weeks when I have time for a
Yeah.
typical slate. I want to look at UFC stats, compare especially pace metrics and takedown defense rates and some of those things, and look at the past 3 fights or so. And if there's something that piques my interest, I want to go back and watch that fight. And that allows me to kind of bias the projection a little bit in the model. I try not to do too much, right? But a little bit of bias in the model just to differentiate myself from my
Hmm.
opponents definitely can help from
What
that
are
perspective.
the sizes of those adjustments that you tend to make?
So it depends on the slate, and sometimes I will notice. I will disagree with ownership, so I can change those fairly dramatic. This past week, I changed a ownership projection by um, by 10 points on a female with a high grappling edge. I'm drawing a blank on her name, but she was projected for 45%. No, sorry, 35% ownership or so. I cut
Hmm.
her down to 29, 28. And I was dead wrong. She came
Yeah.
in at closer to
That
45, and I was absolutely wrong, and it probably ruined my slate.
that
But
happens sometimes, but yeah.
but so maybe don't touch the numbers. Don't take my advice there.
No,
But
I do think you make a good point, and it's something that I've talked about in some of our recent videos that there sometimes is a little bit of a value of making an adjustment even on something that feels a little bit more like a lean because nobody's going to do that the same way you will, especially like
yeah,
MMA. The dupes
yeah,
becomes such a factor. Doing something a little bit
hmm
different than what other people, even using SaberSim and following the kind of the similar process, you'll
yeah.
do it a little bit different because of the adjustments that you made. I think that can be valuable.
And female fighters in general in MMA do tend to come in a little bit lower. I do think in general, compared to the theme, that's a bit of an outlier. That she came
Hmm.
in so high owned this past week. But so often I do tend to lower the ownership of high, um, expensive female favorites. So
Hmm.
just slightly.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think Will has mentioned that as well of like just people kind of tend to not get there as
hmm
easily.
hmm
So,
for sure.
as you were getting started on SaberSim, was there anything that you particularly found kind of hard to figure out or just things that you were uncertain about when you first started using it? Especially, my job trying to help people learn what's going on behind the scenes and the best way to use it. This is always super useful stuff for me to hear.
Yeah. So everything was fairly intuitive for me, but I also had a lot of experience with some different tools around the industry, and
Mhm.
from the perspective of me trying to write all these different features into my simulation tools or my optimizing algorithm, and failing to do so.
Yeah.
I know exactly what the goal is that I was trying to achieve. I've thought my way through a lot of these issues. Um, yeah, I don't think so. I guess I'm not the
That's great
perfect
to hear.
person
That
to
means
ask for
no,
that.
that's good. No, that means that I'm teaching everything
Oh
perfectly.
yeah,
Nobody ever has
yeah,
any questions
yeah,
about how anything works. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, and office hours every single day. I feel like there's always someone there, even if I did have an issue. So
Yeah. Office hours is awesome, and Andrew doing that every day does a great job. So definitely a good research. So after those first couple wins, rack up an NBA win, rack up a couple 1K wins. What was the kind of ramp up process with your contest selection and just your volume and play through that?
yeah, so I try to stick to the lower dollar entries in general. I really honestly all throughout my career, I've kind of intuitively went with SaberSim's profit plan, to an extent.
Yeah.
Not so much from the single entry three max perspective, but definitely fill up the lower dollar entries first. And if I
Hmm.
have money left over in my 2% or so of bankroll, that I want to play on a given night, then I'll scale up the volume. Um, so I haven't really played any DFS for the most part, since this big win.
It's hard
I
to
don't.
use that money, right? Like I've kind of felt that before. If you have a big win, it's like,
Yeah.
oh man, you don't even want to touch it.
Um, so I don't know exactly what I'm gonna do here on out. I'm gonna take a couple weeks and before I think about that.
Hmm.
But up until now, that's always been my process: is fill up those first, and I've never really had the bankroll to really scale up to these massive flagship events or anything like that.
Hmm.
Um, Short of tickets, I mean, I grind these satellites like nobody's business. I had 150 tickets to the Millie Maker
I saw
round
you in there
one.
with a little bit of a sweat towards the end. That was
It was
close.
close. It was close. I lost money on that slate.
Yeah. Well, the end of that game was just crazy too, with Hardy
Yeah,
like all of a sudden kind of going off, and there were just a few weird plays where the leaderboards were just going crazy.
yeah. I effectively had the second place money. I mean, second place lineup, and still managed to lose money. So that's how top heavy these tournaments get, especially the Millie Makers. Um, and that's why I don't like to usually scale up to those.
Hmm.
Um, but I think there's positive value to grinding out satellite tickets and using those as opportunities to take your shot at these massive
Absolutely.
payouts. And I guess I'm good evidence that method works.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And it's something I've thought about as well, especially when you hit that point where you're jumping above $3 on the profit
Hmm.
plan. It's hard to know exactly where that money should go next. And that's a question we get all the time of people that are like, well, should I do, 5 entries into the flagship? Like, where does this money go now?
Yeah.
And I think satellites, and especially, sometimes overlay chasing those satellites can be a good place to just get a little bit of extra action down there.
Yeah, and that I realize that the satellites can kind of break the profit plan a little bit because you don't know exactly how much you're going to enter in XYZ satellite on a given night.
All right, so my camera died here, unfortunately, but a good opportunity for us to talk about some process stuff here. So, walk me through kind of what you're thinking about as you're building your lineups, getting the process started in the app.
Yeah, so like I mentioned previously, when I have time, I like to look at the UFC's official stats page,
Hmm.
as well as watch some different film on fights that I think might be essential to the slate. You can pick out two or three fights that are super important for any given slate in general. So for that 302 slate,
Hmm.
as I mentioned, the Almeida fight, the Aline Perez fight, um, you needed one underdog. You could there was no real super strong underdogs, but I ended up landing on Nico Price. and he got there for me. So that was an essential part. Um, so you can evaluate with some film and be able to identify some key underdogs or key places that you might want to differentiate from the field, especially. Um, and that seems to really help my process.
So what are you actually like looking for in the data?
Hmm.
Because I've always kind of found it hard, especially on the UFC stats, to like figure out like
Yeah.
what am I actually looking for? Like what is
So
important? What stands out to you?
let's look at the Aline Perez fight
Okay.
because that one stands out in my head. So you can
Um,
click like matchup, I think.
I might be on the
Oh, this is
wrong.
301, so 302.
Okay. Yeah, there we go. You said the Perez fight?
Hmm.
Okay.
So Aline Perez, click on Jocelyn Edwards. So Aline Perez, her MO is takedowns, right? She wants to control the fight on the mat. So the key thing to look at is will she be able to do that? So you're looking for takedown defense. How good is Jocelyn
60%.
Edwards at takedown defense? Um, and I would say it was it 65, is that right?
60% is what it's
60%.
showing up.
Well,
Yeah,
it's dropped since I think it was 65 before this past fight.
got
But
it.
yeah, so and whenever you have a common opponent, Nora Cornell, I believe,
Hmm.
both Jocelyn Edwards and Aline Perez actually fought her, and like I mentioned, Jocelyn Edwards predominantly got controlled in that fight um, by Nora Cornell, and
Yeah,
on the opposite side of the coin, Aline Perez controlled Nora Cornell. So I felt like this was essential insight that I gained from watching film and the takedown defense from the stats page. And then to top all that off, whenever I'm comparing Jailton Almeida's projection and range of outcomes to
right.
Perez, then everything tied together makes a very strong argument for choosing Perez over Jailton Almeida to me.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, that makes sense. So, I mean, when it came time to actually build these lineups and say you're even building for a future slate, does that kind of start for you with maybe an adjustment to a projection here, or are you just spotlighting this fighter? And after you run the build, after you run your contest sims, this is somebody you want to make sure you're getting exposure to.
Yeah, so I'll run a naked build usually
Yeah,
first, and just see what I'm getting to. But more often than not, that seems to be where it takes effect. For these favored female fighters, like I mentioned, I will generally drop their ownership, which will lead me to get to a little bit more because they'll look a little bit better, especially in these high dollar tournaments.
hmm.
So that's in general my approach um, to those type of situations for
Is there
sure.
anything that you do up front as well? I'm thinking in particular with
Oh
max
yeah.
salary
Yeah.
to kind of handle dupes.
Yeah. So I definitely restrict my salary a little bit. So 49.7 is generally where I fall with showdowns. NFL showdown, it may be a little bit more aggressive, but for MMA, 49.7 seems to be about the right number for me. Um, and
Hmm.
it's a bit arbitrary, right? And in post processing, I do like to try to pull my lineups and try to make adjustments to the duplicate projection because I have noticed that that's a place where SaberSim does show some area for improvement, area of for improvement,
Yeah,
for
it
lack of better terms.
absolutely does,
But I
and we're
think
aware of that. Yeah.
yeah, but I think that's coming.
Hmm.
And the beta that's out right now, if you want to talk a little bit more about that, I think will at least on the NBA side of things, it did seem to show significant improvements for that duplication side of things.
Yeah, yeah, we have some exciting stuff coming there. Yeah, as you mentioned, NBA Showdown, improved fields. I think the goal is to get that out for the
Hmm.
next UFC card.
Hmm.
NASCAR, tennis, just kind
Hmm.
of all of the dupe sports, getting some higher quality fields there is a big priority because it's a huge part of the strategy.
And this is an issue around the industry. To be
Hmm.
clear, I don't think it's not like a SaberSim exclusive issue. This is the duplication projection is a universal issue to a lot of these different simulation tools. So just even seeing that SaberSim is aware and trying to trying to improve, was a very positive sign to me.
I'm gonna get a contest sim running here so we can at least take a look at these lineups and kind of just see how things are looking. Is there anything that right off the bat you're interested in seeing once the builds finish after you run that naked build?
Yeah, so I mean my process for sure. Um, I like to look at mean versus max ROI within the set of however many that I'm running. So say that's 150, then mean max ROI or RAROI. Sorry.
Hmm.
Um, in general, that's kind of how I'd like to sort with SaberSim. But that's mostly off of your recommendation. I mean, I haven't back tested that
Yeah, yeah, and I
too
like to
often
see those
much.
numbers up there too. I think that's kind of just useful, especially
Uh-huh,
if you're making some adjustments and doing some no
for
ball
sure.
takes. It's just nice to see like, well, okay, what do the Sims think
When do I
about
go
that
too
change?
far?
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. And you
yeah.
see Perez really like jumps right
Oh
out of
yeah.
the gate here for a 20 max build, showing up in quite a
Hmm.
few. What other kind of quality control things are you looking at here? Is there anything that like tends to be a red flag for you, or anything that you kind of are looking for specifically as you're fine tuning?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I want to try to scale up uniques as far as min uniques as far as I can within reason. Usually about two for MMA before I
I like
start
two as
really
well.
reducing the number of lineups within my pool. Um, and but that's not so much a quality of the lineup set issue there. It's more a risk tolerance thing for me. Like I said, I've slowly built my bankroll. I don't tend to take massive stands on
Hmm.
cards. I play a lot of lineups and try to spread my ownership fairly thin. And that's done pretty well for me. So that min uniques just falls perfectly into that
Yeah,
strategy for me.
I like two a lot for MMA. I tend
Hmm.
to find myself getting there. Any of the six player sports, for the most part, I tend to
Hmm.
like falling into that two min unique spot.
For sure.
Is there a particular like piece of advice or insight that you've gotten from anywhere about MMA DFS strategy that kind of changed the way that you thought about it, or that you've applied to your process and found useful?
Yeah. So I mean, MMA there's so many different things that can happen on any
Hmm.
given night, and it I just said I don't like to take super strong stands, but if there's ever a sport to do it, it's these showdown type of slates. Like NFL showdown and MMA are probably the best examples where you can truly take stands in order to for the sole purpose of differentiating yourself. And when you're right, then it dramatically increases your payout. So study film, study how the pros handle these slates, and DFS is a beatable game, right? So if you can study, if you can find these small edges that most people aren't talking about, then you can truly beat the game in the long term.
So you mentioned studying the pros. I'm curious, kind of what your process looks like for that. Are you doing that in flashback, or
Yeah, for
what is
sure.
that? So yeah, let's pull up this slate here. Um, I'm curious, like what you're looking at there. Is it the flagship GPP that you tend to look at here first, or where are you going for that?
Yeah, well, yeah. For the most part, the flagship is because I can compare and contrast the flagship to any of the events that I'm working through, or I try to look at whatever event that I'm playing. Um, so
So the
usually
with the
$20
jab,
four
or
max or
okay,
sorry $4 20 max
gotcha.
is the one that I play every single week religiously.
Did they
Um,
have one for this?
or maybe it was a $3 in the
Might have been a
UFC.
3, yeah. Oh, they have the Mega Mini. They've
Oh
been
yeah,
doing this
that's
recently
right.
here, where
Yeah,
it's the
yeah.
150 max.
I
But let's
usually pump lineups into that, so yeah, that's
okay, cool.
what I'll look at for the most part. And then I like to filter that contest to people who play 150 entries and then compare my predicted ROI to theirs. That's my favorite way to use that tool right now, I think.
Gotcha. So what are you looking at when you're doing that here? So when you're saying your predicted ROI, you're talking about like pre-lock, like the when you
Mm-hmm.
ran your actual initial builds, what did it say?
Mm-hmm.
Versus like
Mm-hmm.
this sim ROI here of these lineups?
Mm-hmm.
Are you looking for discrepancies there, or what's
Yeah,
your
so I just want to see how I compare against the other people that played 150. I don't
Mhm.
know. I think I played 150 on this slate, so maybe if we scroll down far enough, we can find my
Yeah,
name.
the
But
$3 mini is not loading,
oh,
unfortunately. I
okay,
don't think we
okay. Yeah, I
processed it
definitely
correctly. So
didn't
this
play
is the
150
flagship
and
here.
yeah. Okay, that's fine. Um, but yeah, I just like to see how I compared against the best to do it. And then I'll look for recognizable names that I've seen throughout the lobbies that if I've seen them over and over and over again, odds are they're profitable or at least they've spent a lot of time looking, at DFS and
Mhm.
working through their process. Um, so I like to compare myself to them, especially pros that I know rock the SaberSim logo because then we're using the same projections. So it's less of a biased comparison because obviously our simulation, our flashback tool where we get this simulated ROI based on the beginning of the slate is going to be biased to
Yeah.
SaberSim's projections. And that's something that we're aware of. But nonetheless, we want to factor it into
That's a
our
really good point,
evaluation.
and I've never actually even thought about it that way before, but there is a little bit of some value of looking at people that are
Hmm.
using SaberSim or are very likely using SaberSim because they have the logo, does
Yeah,
make it a little more apples to apples of comparing like what they're doing to what you're doing, and that like I don't know the playing field's a little bit more level. I think it's a little easier to potentially learn from that person if you know that they're kind of following a similar base process.
so Shady's probably the best example of this, right? Where I
Yeah,
like to look for his name, look for his average spending, and maybe he was a bit more aggressive and lowered his threshold for how much he wants to spend on a given lineup or
hmm
XYZ. So I like to especially compare to him.
yeah. Yeah, and also a very similar stand on Perez, which does make sense. We saw how much the contest sims were liking
Mm,
that particular fighter
mm.
too. So cool. Yeah. So salary is particularly a big thing that you're diving into here.
For MMA, I think it's a
Yeah.
good example. NFL Showdown's another one where you can see some of the top end players be really aggressive about their average
Extremely
salary
aggressive.
numbers.
Yeah.
And that's where I want to be, but I don't quite have the bankroll to survive that level of variance right now. Well, I didn't. I mean, I still probably don't, not in the major GPPs, but I might be able to be a bit more aggressive in the 20 max this year.
If there was one piece of advice that you would give people building MMA DFS lineups on SaberSim, what would that be?
I would say leave salary on the table. I've done some past evaluations with my own numbers and everything. I don't think nearly enough people are leaving salary on the table. I think the public tends to just spend every single dollar they have available to them and build out the
hmm
same 3 or 4 lineups every single week. So that, especially if you're paying for these high quality tools, that's the fastest way you can really narrow your pool to much more to a much more unique set of lineups.
Yeah, and I'm really excited too as those new field lineups hit the app here in the next
Yeah,
couple weeks to see like how does SaberSim find that edge on its own? Like how does it start playing around salary once those fields get a little
and
tighter?
that's true. Maybe that won't be necessary, after a few iterations of these small tweaks to how SaberSim is projecting dupes. Maybe
hmm
that would no longer be necessary. So that plays into this is a constant. You need to evaluate the lineups that you're playing and look in post at how many dupes that I had. That's another thing I didn't mention. I religiously want to check my average dupes
Yeah.
and compare that to other pros um, and how many unique lineups, how many under fives. Those are all super essential metrics that you want to look at, especially in MMA. So if you're evaluating that with these, it's especially important to evaluate those metrics whenever we're making these small tweaks um, to how we project dupes within within the SaberSim site.
Awesome. Cool. Well, I know we need to start wrapping up here pretty quick. So I do just want to circle back to the big win and say congratulations again and ask you, like, what does this win mean to you and to your family?
Yeah, so like I said, I'm still in school.
Yeah,
I'm 26, so this pays for all the student loan. I don't have a ton, right? But it pays for the student loans that I have from my undergrad. It probably I had a kid in on New Year's Eve of this past year. Uh,
congrats.
uh, I've got a son. His name is Archer. Um, so it probably pays for his school.
That is
If I
amazing.
manage that money well. So I, I'm trying to truly become Dr. 2 Inch. So I'm working on my PhD down here at Alabama.
Okay,
Um,
cool.
and I couldn't feel more blessed. Um, so I'm in a good enough situation where I don't have to spend all of it immediately. I'm planning on probably investing most of it, but I don't want to think about it for at least a week or so more. I want to take some time and talk to a financial advisor and do all my due diligence before I start spending money.
That's awesome. I mean, that's a good way to do it. I've always recommended, even when people have smaller wins, to take a little bit of time before they, you know, potentially just throw that into the next slate or scale up volume super quick. Because
Hmm.
enjoy the moment and think about the right thing to do with it. So
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
a, I think, a good approach. So
yeah. I
cool.
appreciate.
Well, any other final thoughts here for the people watching at home here?
Yeah. I like I said, I think SaberSim. I give them a lot of credit for helping me to improve my process throughout the past year or so, especially. Um, I think I would like to start trying to throw my hat in the ring as far as the content game goes. I think I'd start to like. I think I would like to start reviewing MMA slates, maybe a little bit of football or something. So stay tuned for that.
Awesome. You got
Maybe
your first viewer right here. I'd definitely be tuning in.
I
I've already feel like
appreciate
I've
that.
learned a ton here just talking to you this last hour. So
I appreciate that. So Dr. 2 Inch on Twitter, you can find me there. I don't have a YouTube page or anything yet, but I think I'm gonna try to put something together and really take advantage of getting my name out there a little bit with this big win, and I can hold up the trophy or something in the background
oh, yeah, you didn't
and
even
be
tell
able
me about
to.
a trophy. That is awesome. Very
So
cool.
it's glass, so it's not showing up very well. But
Yeah, no, it still looks slick, yeah.
but that may be able to pull in a little bit of viewers with that trophy
Awesome.
on the wall in the background or something to that effect. So that's kind of where I'm going from this. But other than that, just small slate. I'm still planning on small stakes. As many entries as possible. True DFS profit plan.
I love it, I love it. Are you in our Discord?
Yeah, yeah,
Well,
it should
get
be.
ready for questions the next slate because now that people know your name, they are gonna line up in the MMA channel. They're gonna be pinging you heading into lock, asking for your takes. So get ready for that. But it was awesome to talk to you. I really appreciate you coming on. If anybody has any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comments for this video, or maybe reach out in that MMA channel and Dr. 2 Inch here will be maybe give you a little bit of tips before the next slate. So it was a lot of fun.
Buyer
We'll talk
beware.
to you later. Yeah.